My son looked me dead in the eyes and said, "We figured you'd want to be closer to the bathroom anyway, Dad. Your new room is down the hall." He said it the way you'd tell someone the weather had changed. Casual. Like he was doing me a favor. Like I hadn't just spent 11 days in a hospital bed with a chest full of staples, fighting to get back to the house I'd owned for 31 years. I stood in the doorway of my own bedroom, the room where my wife and I had slept side by side for 2 decades, where she had taken her last breath 4 years ago, and I looked at the unfamiliar bedding, the bottles of perfume on her old dresser, the shoes lined up along the baseboard that were not my shoes. My son's wife had moved in. Not into the guest room, not into the basement, into my bedroom. And my things, my clothes, the photograph of my wife on our wedding day, the watch my father gave me when I turned 30, had been relocated to the narrow room at the end of the hall, like I was a guest who'd overstayed his welcome in his own house. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam a door. I turned around, walked to the kitchen, sat down at the table, and I started making a list. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to where this really started, because the moment in the doorway wasn't actually the beginning. It was just the moment I finally stopped pretending I didn't see what had been building for 2.5 years. My name is Gerald. I'm 64 years old. I spent 38 years working as a project engineer for a mid-sized construction firm outside of Columbus, Ohio. I'm not a man who talks much about his feelings or makes a scene at the dinner table. My wife, Patricia, used to say I process things slowly but thoroughly, like a long burning fire. She meant it as a compliment, I think. She was the quick one, the sharp one, the one who could read a room in 10 seconds and tell you exactly who in it couldn't be trusted. I always figured I had enough of her in me to get by. After she died, I found out how much I'd been leaning on her judgment without realizing it. Patricia passed from a stroke in the spring, 4 years before any of this happened. She was 59 years old. She was in the kitchen making coffee when it happened. Gone in minutes, the doctors said. I don't talk about it much because I still don't have the right words for it. I just know that when I came home to that empty house, something shifted in me that never fully shifted back. My son, Ryan, was 31 at the time. He lived about 40 minutes away with his wife, Cassandra, who everyone called Cassie. They'd been married 3 years. I liked Cassie well enough at the wedding. She was bright, had a good laugh, seemed to love my son. In the months after Patricia died, Ryan started calling more often, stopping by on weekends. I appreciated it. I told myself my son had grown into a good man. About 8 months after the funeral, Ryan came to me with a situation. He'd left his position at a logistics company and was trying to start something on his own, a small freight brokerage. He needed time to get it off the ground. Cassie was working as a dental office manager, but her income alone wasn't enough to cover their rent in the meantime. He asked if they could stay with me for a while. 6 months, maybe 8. Just until the business had some traction. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He was my son. The house had 4 bedrooms and only me in it. Patricia would have said yes too. They moved in on a Tuesday in October with 2 carloads of boxes and a rented truck. Ryan set up a folding table in the guest room as an office. Cassie reorganized the kitchen, which I didn't love but let go because I told myself it was practical. They said they'd cover utilities and split the grocery bill. I said, don't worry about it, just get the business on its feet. I should have written it down. I should have put terms on paper. I know that now. 6 months passed. The business was still in early development. 8 months passed. Ryan said he had a couple of promising leads. A year passed. Cassie got a small raise at work. They bought a dog without asking me first, a large, enthusiastic golden retriever named Duke, who immediately claimed the living room couch as his personal territory. I like dogs, but I would have liked to be consulted. Somewhere in that first year, the dynamic in the house changed in a way I couldn't quite name at the time. Little things. Ryan started answering the door when someone knocked, like it was his house to receive guests at. Cassie rearranged the furniture in the living room and put Patricia's rocking chair in the corner near the window, facing the wall, because she said it threw off the flow. I moved it back. She moved it again a week later. I moved it back again. After the 3rd time, it disappeared entirely. Ryan told me she'd put it in the storage closet because it was getting in the way of Duke's space. I stood in the living room for a long time that evening, looking at the corner where Patricia's chair wasn't. I thought about saying something. Then I thought about how much energy it would take, and how Ryan would look at me with that particular expression he'd started using, patient, slightly concerned, like I was a man who needed to be carefully managed, and I let it go. That was my mistake. Not the chair specifically. The letting go. Every time I let something go, I handed them another inch of the house, and they kept walking forward. Now I have to be honest with myself about something, and I think it's important to say it plainly. I was lonely. After Patricia died, the house had become very quiet in a way that felt different from ordinary silence. When Ryan and Cassie moved in, there was noise and movement, and someone else cooking dinner on Tuesday nights. Part of me, a bigger part than I'm proud of, was relieved to have the company. I think that's why I kept adjusting my expectations downward instead of addressing what was happening. I was trading my boundaries for the feeling of not being alone in my own home. Patricia would have pointed that out to me inside of a month. The 2-year mark came and went. Ryan's business had one client, a single, small account he'd picked up through a college friend, and spent most of its time scaling. The utility bills were still entirely mine. The grocery bill was entirely mine. I had stopped mentioning the original arrangement because every time I approached the subject, Ryan would get quiet and tell me things were complicated right now, that the industry had headwinds, that he didn't want to add stress to the situation, and I would back off. Slowly, without realizing it, I had become a man who needed permission to feel inconvenienced in his own house. Then, 14 months ago, I had a heart attack. I was 63, in decent shape for my age, had my cholesterol watched, exercised when the weather let me. It came anyway, on a Wednesday morning in February while I was shoveling the back walk, a tightness that became a pressure, that became something I could not reason my way through. I sat down on the steps and called 911 myself, because Ryan and Cassie had both left for the day, and my phone was in my coat pocket. The surgery was a triple bypass. 11 days in the hospital. I remember waking up in the ICU with tubes in my arms and a nurse adjusting something near my head. And my first coherent thought was that I needed to call Patricia. The second thought was remembering why I couldn't. That was the worst 40 seconds of the whole ordeal. Ryan visited. He sat with me for a few hours the first 2 days, then every other day, then every few days as my stay extended. Cassie came twice. She brought flowers the first time, which I appreciated. I noticed she spent most of that visit on her phone near the window. I didn't say anything. Near the end of my hospital stay, my doctor, a careful, straightforward man who did not believe in softening information, sat with me and explained what the recovery would look like. 8 to 12 weeks of limited activity. No heavy lifting. No driving for 4 weeks. Physical therapy 3 times a week. I would need to take the stairs carefully, rest frequently, monitor my blood pressure twice daily. He asked if I had someone at home to help with basic tasks in the first 2 to 3 weeks. I told him my son and daughter-in-law were living with me. He nodded and wrote something in his notes. I think he could tell from the way I said it that things were more complicated than they sounded. My neighbor, a retired postal worker named Howard, who had been friends with Patricia and me for almost 20 years, offered to pick me up from the hospital on the morning I was discharged. Ryan had told me the evening before that he had a call with his one client that morning and couldn't get away, but that he'd be home by the time I arrived. Howard pulled up to the hospital entrance in his old Buick and carried my bag to the car without making a thing of it, the way good people do. We pulled into my driveway just before 11 in the morning. Howard helped me up the front steps, which took longer than I wanted it to. I thanked him at the door. He said to call him for anything, and I believed him. I walked inside. The house felt different in a way I couldn't immediately explain. Warmer, maybe. Different smells, a candle burning somewhere, something floral I didn't recognize. Duke came bounding in from the living room, and I had to brace myself against the wall to keep from being knocked over. Ryan came out of the kitchen with a look on his face that I had not seen before and did not like immediately. It was the look of a man who had prepared something to say. He said he was glad I was home. He said the recovery had been scary, and he wanted to make sure I was comfortable. He said there was something he needed to tell me about the room arrangements. I asked him what he was talking about. He told me that while I was in the hospital, he and Cassie had decided that the master bedroom, my bedroom, The room I had slept in for 31 years would be more practical for Cassie, because she had some health issues of her own that I apparently hadn't been told about, and that she needed better access to the bathroom attached to that room, and that, frankly, the room at the end of the hall would be easier for me during recovery because it was closer to the kitchen and I wouldn't have to walk as far. He said it like this was a kindness. He said it like he had done me a service. I walked down the hall to my bedroom. The door was open. I looked in. Cassie's things were everywhere. The perfume bottles on what had been Patricia's dresser. A stack of paperback novels on what had been my nightstand. The photograph of Patricia and me at our wedding, the one I'd kept on the dresser for 4 years, the one I looked at every morning, was gone. The watch my father gave me was gone. My clothes were gone. The room had been, in the most literal sense, taken over. There was nothing of mine in it. I stood there for a moment. I heard Ryan come up behind me. He started to say something about how it was temporary, just until they figured things out, just practical for the recovery period. I turned around and looked at my son. He was 33 years old, and he was standing in my hallway justifying why I no longer had access to my own bedroom. He looked like he expected me to understand. I walked to the room at the end of the hall and opened the door. My clothes had been moved into the closet in a heap, not hung. My father's watch was on the window ledge like it had been set down and forgotten. The wedding photograph was face down on the shelf. Face down. I don't know if Cassie had done that deliberately, or if it had just happened that way in the moving and I decided it didn't matter. The effect was the same. I picked up the photograph and stood there looking at Patricia for a moment. She was laughing in the picture. It was one of the candid shots, not the posed ones, caught right after we'd finished our first dance. Her head thrown back a little, her eyes bright. I had looked at that photograph every morning for 4 years because it was the most alive she had ever looked in any picture ever taken of her. I set the photograph carefully on the dresser, face up. I sat down on the edge of the bed. I breathed for a few minutes because my chest was still tender, and my doctor had told me to breathe deliberately when I felt my pulse rising. Then I thought about what I was going to do. Ryan knocked on the door and asked if I needed anything. I told him I needed some rest. He said okay and went away. I heard him talking quietly with Cassie at the other end of the house. I could not hear what they were saying. That afternoon, while Ryan was on what he said was a business call and Cassie had gone to run errands, I did something I had been avoiding for 2.5 years, because I did not want to feel what I knew it would make me feel. I went through my finances. What I found took me about 40 minutes to fully understand. In the early months after Patricia died, I had given Ryan access to one of my bank accounts, a secondary checking account I used for household expenses so he could handle utility payments and groceries when I traveled. At the time, it made sense. I trusted my son, and I didn't want to worry about automatic payments while I was away at a conference or visiting my sister in Phoenix. I had not revisited that arrangement carefully in 3 years. Over the course of those 3 years, the withdrawals from that account did not match anything I could account for with household expenses. There were regular transfers, small enough not to immediately trigger alarm, 200 here, 300 there, to an external account I didn't recognize. Sometimes twice in a month. Over 30 months, the total was not small. I sat with that for a long time. I looked at the numbers several times to make sure I was reading them correctly. I was. I want to be honest about what that moment felt like, because I think it's important. It wasn't rage, not at first. It was something worse than rage. It was the sensation of the ground rearranging itself beneath you, the feeling of realizing that what you thought was solid had been hollow for a long time. This was my son. I had sat at a hospital bedside with this boy when he was 8 and had his tonsils out. I had taught him to drive a manual transmission in an empty church parking lot on a Sunday morning. I had given the toast at his wedding and meant every word of it. The idea that he had been quietly, methodically taking money from an account I trusted him with felt like something I did not have a category for. I did not confront him that evening. I did not say anything at dinner. Ryan had ordered pizza, possibly out of guilt, possibly just because it was easy, while Duke settled under the table hoping for crusts, and Cassie talked about a coworker situation I had no context for. I ate 2 slices of pizza and said I was tired and went to the room at the end of the hall. I called my sister Diane that night. She lives in Phoenix. She's 3 years older than me, and she has what Patricia used to call A clean mind. She can look at a situation without sentiment getting in the way. I told her everything, the bedroom, the money, all of it. She listened without interrupting, which is something not everyone can do. When I finished, there was a pause. She said, "Gerald, you already know what you need to do. You're calling me because you want to hear that you're allowed to do it." She was right. She usually is. The next day, while Ryan was out picking up a prescription and Cassie was at work, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to my attorney, a woman named Beverly who had handled Patricia's estate and who I had known professionally for 15 years. I told her I needed to revisit my estate documents and that I had a financial matter I wanted her to look at. She told me to come in whenever I was ready. I told her I'd be there in a few days, once I was cleared to drive. The second call was to my bank. I told them I wanted to remove Ryan's access to the household account immediately and change the account number. The woman on the phone was professional and efficient and did not ask me why. I appreciated that. The third call was to a locksmith. I explained my situation without going into full detail. He asked me what I needed. I told him I needed every exterior lock on the house rekeyed, the master bedroom door lock changed, and a new lock installed on the door to my home office. He said he could be there the following morning. Ryan came home while I was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, looking out the window at the backyard. He asked if I was feeling okay. I said I was. I asked him how the prescription run went. He said fine. He poured himself a glass of water, and then he looked at me for a moment like he was trying to read something in my face. He asked if something was wrong. I said, "We'll talk tomorrow. I need another day of rest first." He nodded slowly and left the kitchen. I could tell he was unsettled. I went back to looking at the backyard. The maple tree along the fence was just starting to show the first pale green of new leaves. Patricia had planted that tree the first spring we lived in the house. It was barely a sapling then. Now it was taller than the roof. The locksmith came the next morning at 9. He was quiet and thorough and finished the job in about an hour and 20 minutes. He rekeyed all 3 exterior doors, changed the master bedroom lock, and installed a keyed deadbolt on my office door. I gave him a tip in cash. Ryan came downstairs while the locksmith was still working. He watched for a moment without saying anything. Then he asked me what was going on. I told him I would explain everything at 1 o'clock. I asked him to make sure Cassie was home. He looked at the locksmith, then back at me, and then went upstairs without another word. At 1 o'clock, we sat at the kitchen table, the 3 of us. I had slept better than I had in months. My chest was still sore, and I moved carefully, but my head was clear in a way it hadn't been in a long time. I thought about Patricia. I thought about what she would say if she could see this table right now, her husband sitting across from her son and his wife in the house she'd loved. I thought she'd say, "Stop adjusting. Stand still." I told them 3 things, in order, calmly. First, I told Ryan I had reviewed the household account, and I had documentation of the transfers to the external account. I told him I had already removed his access and changed the account number. I told him I was not going to involve the police at this time, but that I needed him to understand. I knew exactly what had happened, and I had every record of it, and I had spoken with my attorney. There was a silence. Ryan's face went through several things quickly. Cassie looked at her hands. Ryan started to say something about the business, about cash flow, about intending to pay it back, about how things had gotten desperate in a way he couldn't explain to me because he didn't want me to worry. I listened. I let him finish. Then I asked him why, if he was in that much financial difficulty, he had not simply told me. I had been there. I had been in that house. He had eaten dinner with me most evenings for 2.5 years. At any point he could have sat across from me, the way we were sitting now, and said, "Dad, I'm struggling. I need help." I would have helped him. That is what a father does. He didn't have an answer for that. I didn't expect one. Second, I told them that I wanted my bedroom back. I was not discussing this. I was not negotiating it. I wanted my clothes, my father's watch, the photograph, and all of my belongings returned to the master bedroom by end of day. I told Cassie she and Ryan were welcome to continue using the guest room, which had been their room since they moved in, and that the room at the end of the hall was available to her as a second space if she needed it. I told her I was sorry to hear she had health issues, but that this arrangement was not something that had been discussed with me, and my bedroom was not something anyone had the right to reassign without my consent. Cassie started to say something about her condition, about needing the attached bathroom. I asked her, gently, to tell me what her condition was, because I genuinely did not know, and no one had mentioned it to me before the day I came home from the hospital. There was a pause. She said it was a stomach issue. She said the bathroom situation was important for her comfort. I told her I understood, and I was sympathetic, and she was still moving back to the guest room. Third, I told them that I needed them to begin making concrete plans for a transition. I was not asking them to leave tomorrow. I understood they had a situation, but the open-ended arrangement that had begun with 6 to 8 months was now entering its third year, and it needed an end date. I was giving them 60 days to figure out their next step. After 60 days, I would need them to be in the process of moving out. I told them I would not charge them back rent, and I would not press legal action on the financial matter provided we came to an agreement with my attorney. But I needed my house back, and I needed to know it was going to happen on a schedule. Ryan looked like I had told him something he had known was coming, but hoped to avoid indefinitely. Cassie looked like she was doing math in her head. Neither of them said much. Ryan asked if we could talk about it more over the next few days. I said, of course. I said the timeline was still the timeline. I got up from the table, made myself another cup of coffee, and went out to sit on the back porch. It was a cool afternoon, the sky that particular pale blue you get in Ohio in early spring. The maple tree was casting a long shadow across the grass. Duke came and lay down next to my chair, his chin on his paws, doing what dogs do, just being present, no agenda. I rested my hand on his back and sat there for a long time. In the weeks that followed, things moved slowly, and then all at once, the way they often do. Ryan went through several phases in fairly quick succession. The first was a kind of wounded dignity, where he treated me with careful politeness and seemed to be waiting for me to feel guilty. I did not feel guilty. I felt sad sometimes, in the way you feel sad when you realize something you loved has become something else. But that is different from guilt. The second phase was an attempt at explanation. He came to me one evening and sat down and talked for almost 2 hours about the business, about the pressure he'd been under, about the fact that he'd been too proud to admit he was failing, about how taking the money had started as what he called borrowing and had escalated in a way he lost control of. I listened to all of it. I believed most of it. I told him I understood how it had happened, and that understanding how something happens does not make it acceptable. I told him I was not interested in punishing him. I was interested in him building a life that was actually his. I asked him directly, what did he want his life to look like at 40? He thought about it for a while. Then he said, honestly, that he wasn't sure the freight brokerage was it. He said he'd been doing it because it seemed like something he was supposed to want, a business of his own, the independence. He said he actually missed working on a team. He said he'd been looking at a position with a regional distribution company that had come up through a contact. I told him to apply for it. He blinked at me like he'd expected a different conversation. I told him there was no shame in working a good job. I told him his grandfather, my father, the man whose watch was back on my dresser where it belonged, had worked the same job for 26 years and considered it an honorable thing. Ryan was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. He applied for the position the following week. He got an interview. Cassie took the news of the timeline harder than Ryan did. She went through a period of pointed silences and small disapprovals, sighing at the rearranged furniture, making comments about how unsettled things felt, going to bed early and loudly. I did not engage with any of it. I was not unkind, but I was not apologetic. I asked her once, straightforwardly, if she wanted to talk about the situation. She said no. I said that was fine, and left her to it. About 3 weeks after our kitchen table conversation, I drove myself to Beverly's office. It was the first time I'd driven since before the surgery, and I'll admit it felt good, the simple, ordinary independence of sitting in my own car, choosing my own route, arriving somewhere under my own power. Beverly's office is in a building downtown with a parking garage that charges too much, and I didn't care at all. We went through my estate documents carefully. I made several changes. My will had previously left the house, and the majority of my assets to Ryan outright, with some smaller portions directed to Diane, and a few charitable interests Patricia and I had cared about. I restructured it substantially. Ryan's portion was reduced significantly and now subject to conditions. I set up a trust with Beverly as the designated trustee, which meant the assets would be managed by someone with no stake in rushing me out of the picture. Diane received a larger share. I directed a meaningful portion toward a foundation Patricia had volunteered with for years. I did not tell Ryan about the changes. This was deliberate. I was not hiding it maliciously. These were my assets to direct as I saw fit, but I also did not feel that my estate planning was something I owed him a preview of. If he asked me directly someday, I would be honest. He didn't ask. I also worked out an agreement with Beverly regarding the financial matter, the transfers from the household account. Ryan signed a document acknowledging the amounts and committing to repayment over a structured, interest-free schedule of 2 years. It was more lenient than it had any right to be, and I made that point plainly to Ryan when he signed it. He did not argue. He looked, for the first time in a long while, like a man who was reckoning with himself rather than managing me. The 60 days came and went. Ryan and Cassie were not fully out, but they were genuinely in process. Ryan had been offered the distribution position and accepted it. They had found an apartment about 20 minutes away, 2 bedrooms, reasonable rent, within their combined budget. They'd put down a deposit. They were moving the last of their things on a Saturday in June. I helped them load boxes into the rented truck, carefully, within my limits. Not because I felt obligated, but because Ryan was still my son, and I was still his father, and that remained true through all of it. When the truck was packed, Ryan stood in the driveway for a moment. He looked at the house. Then he looked at me. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I mean it. Not the prepared version. Actually, sorry." I believed him. I told him I knew. I told him I would be at his new apartment for dinner whenever he invited me, and that the invitation needed to come from him. He nodded. Cassie said goodbye from the passenger window. I waved. They drove off. Duke, who had apparently decided to accept me as his primary person sometime in the previous month, sat next to me on the driveway and watched the truck until it turned the corner. The house was quiet when I went back inside. Not the hollow quiet it had been after Patricia died, when the silence had its own weight and texture. A different kind of quiet. The quiet of a space that is yours again. The quiet of rooms that are waiting for you to inhabit them on your own terms. I went to my bedroom. My bedroom? My clothes in the closet hung properly. My father's watch on the dresser where it belonged, and Patricia's photograph in its place, her head thrown back, laughing, more alive in that picture than anyone I have ever known. I stood there looking at her for a while. Then I went to the kitchen, made a proper pot of coffee, real coffee, in the French press I had bought years ago, and Ryan had moved to a high shelf because it was taking up counter space, and I took my cup out to the back porch. Duke followed and settled next to my chair. The maple tree was fully leafed out now, the shadow long and green across the yard. A pair of cardinals were doing something complicated in the upper branches. The air smelled like cut grass from somewhere down the street. I want to say something to anyone listening to this who might be in the middle of a situation like mine, because I know this kind of thing doesn't only happen to me. I know there are people out there who love their children more than anything they've ever known, and who are sitting in houses that have slowly stopped feeling like their own, and who have been making themselves smaller month by month without quite understanding how it happened. Here is what I want you to know. The love and the boundary are not in conflict. I did not stop loving my son. I will never stop loving my son. But I had spent 2.5 years behaving as though protecting myself was something I needed his permission for, and it was not. My house is mine. My finances are mine. My bedroom is mine. My father's watch, and the photograph of my wife, and the rocking chair that Patricia sat in for 20 years, those things are mine. Not because I am selfish, because they are the evidence of a life I built, and a woman I loved, and a man I have tried to be. No one gets to relocate those things to a room at the end of a hall. Not while I am standing. There is something else I want to say, more quietly. I think a part of me, the part that was lonely and tired and still grieving in ways I hadn't fully acknowledged, had been using my son's presence in the house as a substitute for dealing with the fact that Patricia was gone. The noise and the movement and the Tuesday night dinners had given me permission not to sit with the silence, and I had let that go on far longer than was good for either of us. By tolerating the slow erosion of my own home, I had also been failing Ryan in a specific way. I had been making it easy for him to avoid becoming the man he needed to become. When I finally did what I should have done a year earlier, it was hard for both of us. But Ryan is, right now, in his own apartment, working a job he actually likes, building a life that is actually his, and I think that is what a father is supposed to want for his son. I am not a man who revisits his decisions much once they're made. Patricia used to tease me about that. She said I had the emotional processing speed of a glacier, but once I started moving, I cut through everything. I think that's probably fair. The cardinals in the maple tree eventually sorted out whatever disagreement they were having. Duke gave a long sigh and rolled onto his side in the sun. His ears relaxed, the effortless contentment of a dog on a warm morning. I drank my coffee. I thought about calling Diane. I thought about the garden along the back fence that I had let go, untended for 3 years, and whether this was the season I would finally get back to it. I put my hand on the arm of my chair, on my porch, in my house, and I thought, yes, this is the season.